Buenas tardes.
Bienvenidos. Welcome to the Big Read Kickoff event.
Bienvenidos a la gran apertura del tiempo de lectura de la Biblioteca de Kenosha.
We are very fortunate to have Santiago Vaquera-Vasquez here with us this evening. Santiago is a writer, a professor, and someone who is very experienced in crossing borders.
Qué afortunados somos al ser visitados por Santiago Vaquera-Vasquez. Santiago es un escritor, profesor y un hombre con mucha experiencia en el tema de cruzar fronteras.
Santiago was born and raised in Northern California and spent summers traveling across the border to visit with family in Mexico.
Santiago nació y creció en el norte de California y pasaba sus veranos en México visitando su familia.
This life experience helped him understand what it means to belong to two cultures, the culture of your heritage and the culture where you live.
La experiencia de cruzar la frontera para visitar su familia le ayudó a entender lo que significa pertenecer a dos culturas, su cultura de su familia y dónde vivía.
His stories are about migration, how it changes people, and how cultures change when they are blended.
Santiago tiene historias de migración. Él nos muestra cómo migrar nos cambia y cambia nuestras culturas.
Currently a professor at the University of New Mexico, Santiago has been writing books for about 16 years, mostly in Spanish.
Santiago actualmente es profesor de la Universidad de Nuevo México. Él ha escrito por más de 16 años. Muchos de sus libros son en español.
Santiago believes reading and writing are essential to our cultures and encourages us all to write down our own stories.
Santiago cree que leer y escribir son cualidades esenciales para nosotros y nuestras culturas. Él nos invita a escribir nuestra propia historia.
He says, when we tell our stories, we are bringing our community together. It's an important function in our community, and it helps to bring the past into the present. It not only helps us to understand who we are, but who we could be, and how we can visualize ourselves in the future.
Él dice, cuando nosotros contamos nuestras historias, hacemos comunidad. Contar nuestras historias es una función muy importante en nuestras comunidades. Ayuda a hacer presente el pasado y no solo nos ayuda a entender mejor quiénes somos, sino quiénes podemos llegar a ser y cómo podemos vernos en el futuro.
We are so glad to have Santiago here tonight to share some of his stories with us. Please join us in welcoming Santiago Vaquera-Vasquez.
Qué alegría es tenerte, Santiago, en medio de nosotros contando y viviendo historias, haciendo comunidad con nosotros. Recibamos con cariño a Santiago. Bárbara, Santiago, I felt like in the Grammys, you know? Wow. Welcome.
Gracias. Wow. Welcome. Thank you so much. I think maybe I'll just keep this. I have this wireless mic to walk around, but I think I'll stand. This is a new experience for me, standing up at a pulpit. My mother always says I should go to church more often, so I apologize, Father, for confessing that I don't go to church enough. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here in Kenosha with you all. For me, it is a great honor to be here with you all tonight. It's especially a great honor because I get to talk about a friend of mine, Luis Alberto Urrea, who will be here with you all in a month. So. But I'd like to begin by thanking our Aztec dancers. I have no idea how I'm going to follow that up. I'm still just sort of blown away by that beautiful, amazing performance by local parishioners, ¿verdad? Right? There were local dancers in the to the parish, and I believe that is a really fantastic practice. I would like to dedicate my remarks to them. I would like to dedicate my remarks to those who find themselves feeling maybe sometimes that they're not entirely that they feel themselves at times marginalized. People who feel at times find themselves in shadows. I would like to remind them that they're not, that they are a part of a community, and that what they do is really important. Even in the Midwest, to see Aztec dancers by the side of a frozen lake is amazing. So I would like to start off by doing a shout out. A shout out to all those who help with their labor, who help us put together events as these, to students who sit in our classes and help us remain honest in this dialogue that is learning. They learn from us, we learn from them. This is a shout out to the workers. This is a shout out to the many arrested around the world for speaking up. This is a shout out for those who, as they discover that traditional forms of resistance are being cut back, find new ways to resist, to speak up. This is a shout out for my Latina community, the 50 million of us living, working, and contributing to the United States, demanding to not be sent back to live in the shadows. This is a shout out for those who cross borders. This is a shout out for those of us who live ordinary and less ordinary lives. This is a shout out for those who work towards keeping our stories alive in our communities across the United States. John Philip Santos, in his memoir, Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation, writes, "Whether we're born north or south of the border, rich or poor, proud or contrite, we decide whether we will continue to abandon the often beautiful, sometimes terrifying stories of the past by small degrees, or against the drift to remember, to salvage, to conjure, and resurrect them anew. So this too is an act of resistance towards being marginalized, towards having our stories forgotten, and an act of affirmation for those of us who work in the streets, who make our cities splendid, who work in the shops, who work in the libraries, who keep our movement flowing, and who create art. Those who create art, unafraid of the shadow that follows America, the shadow of the fear of others." The Chicano poet Ricardo Sanchez once wrote, "Who are we? We are the urgent voices," he answered. And this is a shout out for us, the urgent voices. So what I'd like to do is tell a number of stories. Reflections really about being a border crosser. But I'm going to start first I'm going to start talking about the reason that we have these wonderful events here in Kenosha. The novel Into the Beautiful North by Luis Alberto Urrea. What we talk about when we talk about Luis Alberto Urrea. Allow me to tell you a story. A story about a vato from San Diego, Califas, now living up in El Norte, outside Chicago. Luis Alberto Urrea. This is what we talk about when we talk about Urrea. All those things that make him one of the finest of our Latino storytellers. Whether that story be about a woman in late 19th century Mexico called a living saint and inspiring a community of poor and marginalized to imagine a better world for themselves. Or a priest working amongst the poor in the dumps of Tijuana. Or a young girl from a small village on the Mexican coast journeying into the beautiful north in search of men who will come and help her take back her town from a gang of narcos. That same young girl traveling even further north to the mysterious sounding town of Kankakee, Illinois, in search of her father, who, like the other men in her village, left one day to seek a life allá en el norte. 26 Mexican migrants who journey into the desert and get lost. A grieving white man who returns to the Lakota reservation to bury his Oglala wife and try to make his peace with her family. A dying patriarch who organizes his final birthday party for the day after he buries his mother. These are stories that effortlessly blend tragedy and humor and always lay bare the scars that run through family, departures, and migration. And in their telling, there's a form of confession, an attempt at a connection, a lifeline that is sought for someone who is lost. Urrea is a writer of witness. Reading his work, we bear witness to lives in the borderlands, whether it be the U.S.-Mexico border or wherever different communities come into contact and meet and love and disagree and touch and try just to find those bridges across the borders that separate them. He writes about America, pues. America in America, America in America. In his novel, Into the Beautiful North, we can see it is another narrative of belonging. It's a continued exploration of the themes we often find in his work: familia, language, diaspora, quest for connection, for empathy. It is also about storytelling. It's a novel about family divided not just by the U.S.-Mexico border, but also by family itself. Written in the shadow of the film The Magnificent Seven, the story is about a young girl, Nayeli, who travels north to the United States from her Mexican coastal village of Tres Camarones to find 7 men who will protect her town from a drug gang who has arrived. Seeing that most of the men have left, they've decided to set up camp there. And she travels with 2 friends and Tacho, the gay owner of the local bar, who goes to act as protector of these 3 young women. But Nayeli has another plan. One of the men she wants to bring back is her father, who had left years before. And the group eventually arrives to San Diego, where they start finding men who are willing to return to Mexico to help the village. And at this point, the novel then turns to the next part of the quest, which is Nayeli's search for her father. It is this part where the novel becomes a road novel, as Nayeli and Tacho travel together into the Midwest, further into the beautiful north, to the town of Kankakee, Illinois, and for what she hopes is a fruitful reunion with her father. It is here where this book becomes urgent. Not because Nayeli is urgent for the reunion with her father, but because the novel presents another important aspect of Latino life, that of Latinos in the Midwest. What is often lacking in contemporary Latina studies is recognition, documentation, and celebration of these Latino Midwest populations and their histories, as well as the critical, analytical, and strategic concepts that help us plot their narratives in relationship to more established ones about Latinos in the U.S. And this is why this book, I argue, is urgent. It is urgent in an age when we are being told that we don't belong, that we don't contribute to culture, that we only live in particular regions, that we are criminals, we're violent. This book replies with a story about family and connections and the celebration of our community in different parts of the U.S. Let me say a few words about the Latinos in the Midwest. I currently live in the Southwest, but I used to live in the Midwest. I lived in Iowa for about 5 years. And while I was there, one of my colleagues and I started talking, and one of my colleagues in the history department started talking about putting together a book of articles about Latino communities in the Midwest, because he was from Texas, I was from California, and we often sort of had these coastal borderland ideas about what Latino communities were like. And what we discovered when we both moved to Iowa, we discovered that the Midwest has a very rich culture. Not just the cultures that have been here, but also the culture that has arrived from by these new communities. And we should also remember, maybe I shouldn't say new, right, that the Latino communities in the Midwest are not really new. They've actually been in the region since the late 19th century. Because, as we know, right, they provided their labor to various Midwestern industries, and they spread their culture throughout rural and urban areas. Mexican Americans and Mexicans were the first Latinos who arrived in large numbers to the Midwest, and they were followed by the Puerto Ricans, by Cuban Americans, and eventually Central and South Americans. Knowing this immigration story or history will help us understand Latinos' long-standing ties to the Midwest, the region's appeal to new migrants, and the opportunities and tensions introduced by successive waves of Latino newcomers. For immigrants arriving from Mexico or after a brief stay in Texas, the Midwest was appealing. It was appealing because they experienced less overt racism than in Texas. And those migrating to Midwestern rural areas also liked the slower pace of life, which was similar to the rural areas from which they originated. And a yearly pattern of circular migration between the Midwest and Texas or Mexico emerged for some agricultural workers and would eventually result in permanent settlement in the Midwest when some laborers left the migrant stream. Now, this is a longer history, but more recently, the Latino populations really grew in the Midwest from the period between 2000 and 2010. the Latino population grew by 70% in the Midwest. This is not to say that that we have massive numbers. In Iowa, it's still around 7% now. I'm not quite sure in Wisconsin, but I do know that I have heard that in Kenosha, for example, there's a very large Latino population, which I found very, very interesting when I drove into town this afternoon to see not just taquerias, but also a wedding store, also advertising for quinceañeras, right? And that to me speaks of a really important, vibrant aspect of the community. So while many Latinos have moved to the region for urban jobs, others have filled a labor need in rural towns where the deunionization of the meatpacking industry has created economic opportunities for immigrants willing to work for non-union wages. Now, those are just some interesting facets of the history of Latinos. What I focus on is more on sort of the cultural production, and for me, it's the questions of how Latino communities or immigrant communities make place. How do they create narratives of belonging? And so when we look at the Latino communities, we should take a look at performance. For example, Aztec dancers. Through storytelling, through art and visual culture, through soundscapes, right? As well as their physical presence in churches, in workplaces, in schools, nightclubs, community centers, and museums. Here's a couple of examples of the type of placemaking that I'm interested in, or that I've witnessed. So you all know, right, that outside of Clear Lake, Iowa, rock and roll died in the 1950s, right? With the death of Richie Valens, Buddy Holly, and the Big Bopper. So a half mile hike into a tilled field where the plane went down reveals a site dedicated to Richie Valens, to Buddy Holly, and to the Big Bopper. It's a modest memorial that now marks the location of the plane crash that claimed the lives of these three, as well as the pilot. The tender offerings that the farm owner and visitors have deposited along a barbed wire fence include the names of the deceased engraved into steel replicas of vinyl records, a guitar, and an airplane, a whirligig made of aluminum jello molds, an antique microphone, love beads, flowers, stuffed animals, and fan letters. Though several pairs of thick-rimmed sunglasses or eyeglasses suggest that Buddy Holly draws a fair share of pilgrims to the site, the overall display of mourning is Latinized. And it is Latinized in this way, because it is very similar to the roadside memorials that increasingly dot not only Midwestern highways, but also the Southwest. And that is, they are linked to this notion that we have in the South, this folk tradition of the descanso, of putting up an altar where a family member has passed away. They're these improvised memorials for fallen travelers, and they date back to the Spanish colonization of the Americas. In contrast to the Richie Valens Memorial, there's also the Hero Street Memorial in Silvis, Illinois. It's about 200 miles from Clear Lake, and the sculpture's rectangular base features a series of 8 bronze portraits of deceased Mexican-American servicemen. Atop the portrait sits a Mayan step pyramid structure that is in turn crowned by an enormous bronze eagle in flight, which clutches in its talons a rifle and the U.S. flag. This memorial was designed by a former junior high school teacher to commemorate the deceased combatants in World War II and the Korean War, all of whom resided within a single block-and-a-half stretch of 2nd Street in Silvis, a neighborhood which has been dubbed Hero Street, USA. Mexican immigrants who arrived to work in the Quad Cities railroad industry during the 20s and the 30s established this neighborhood, and 100 of their sons and daughters have gone on to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, distinguishing Hero Street with a density of military service and loss that is unparalleled in other parts of the United States. In an interview for a documentary about Hero Street, Danilo Sandoval, the surviving brother of two Hero Street servicemen killed in World War II, describes his brother's sacrifice and the Hero Street Memorial more broadly as an assertion of citizenship and attachments to this place. And he quotes, we're of Mexican descent, but we're all Mexican Americans, and this is our country, this is home. This is really important for understanding that narrative that is often passed around saying that we do not belong. Here we have a rich tradition of Latinos who have participated in the military and served our country. Another example, and this is one I think is, for me, it's particularly poignant. One of the most important works of Chicano literature is a short book titled "And the Earth Did Not Swallow Him," "Y no se lo tragó la tierra," by the Chicano author Tomás Rivera, who grew up in a migrant worker family in Texas. He's from Texas, but his family traveled the migrant trail through the Midwest, and many of the stories that are narrated in this particular book, these short vignettes, are set in these Midwestern towns where they pass through. One of the towns that he passed through as a child was in Hampton, Iowa. And when he was a child, he discovered the library. And he discovered the public library and a librarian there who recognized in him a reader. And so she began to give him books. And from there, he began his education as a reader, his life as a reader, that would eventually lead him to becoming one of the first Chicano university presidents in the nation. There's a book about this experience. It's titled, it's by the Texas writer, Pat Mora, and it's titled, Tomás and the Library Lady. Today, local children perform a play based on Pat Mora's book at the Hampton Public Library, and residents are proud of their connection to the young man who went on to become the first Chicano university president. Pat Mora's account of Rivera's childhood experience foregrounds the Midwestern setting as a significant location of inter-Latino and inter-ethnic social interaction and community formation, rather than as a mere traumatic interlude or ellipsis within a larger South Texas-based narrative. In Hampton, stories by and about Rivera still circulate orally and through parent culture and performance. They offer the community a means to imagine itself as a Latino Midwestern town, and broadly speaking, to build a bridge between the recent Latino arrivals and long-standing patterns of Latino residences in the area. And for me, this is particularly important, for I too am a child of the library. When I first learned to read about the age of 4.5, the first place I spent most of my time was at the school library in my elementary school, and also the public library. And it was through reading that I learned to travel. Those were my first educations and my first moments in going other places. I could visit other worlds, I could visit other times, I could visit other countries. I could see how other people lived their lives. And for me, this was fundamental and important for my own process as a writer. For we are the sum of all our belongings. I grew up in a family of storytellers. When I was young, my summers were spent in Mexico, in Mexicali, right across the border from California. In the evenings, I remember my uncles and my aunts, my tios and my tias, sitting around the kitchen table telling stories about relatives, about people they knew, and sometimes they would tell ghost stories. These were the ones that chilled my spine, even to this day, because Mexicali seemed to be full of cuentos de espantos. But more than the types of stories, it was the act of storytelling that got me, because it is in story that we start constructing community, that we start knitting together and giving shape to our lives. Inevitably, in the stories, there was the one about the friend, the relative, the cousin, the uncle who crossed the border and left, the aunt who disappeared, the sister who died, the one who went away. And in the telling of their stories, they were bringing back that person, tying that person back into our present through a thread of history and storytelling. And after all, this is why we tell stories, right? We're bearing witness. We're bringing back those who are ours, knitting our community together. And storytelling is a form of binding of one to another. We recover the stories of those that we lost so that we can continue to add meaning to that person, that place, that community. In telling the stories and telling our stories, writers are creating a tie that also links to another, a reader who listens. And to succeed in having someone who will listen implies an ethical responsibility upon the listener. It's a bond because that responsibility is understanding. And to accept that is to acknowledge the life and the experience of the speaker. There is that quote that I've seen in various places. I often use it from Zizek, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it. The enemy is the one whose story we don't know. To know that story, to know their story, to recognize the other not as an enemy, but perhaps as a potential ally, opens up a space for dialogue and hopefully communication. Mine is a community bound by story and travel, threaded across distance, held together by history, and bound in a book that travels with me. Part of my job, I always tell my students, and I always tell publics when I give presentations, is these. Part of my job, probably the smallest part, is to tell a story. The other half is to listen to others tell me theirs. In this way, hopefully, we can bridge those things that would attempt to separate us. Because if there's one constant in my life, it is crossing borders. If my work has any meaning, it's because I live and I travel across borders, not without fear nor with a fixed route. It's also because I cross border because I often carry a better soundtrack in my head. It's also because of the people I meet. They always have interesting stories to tell. And while others fear border crossing because of the supposed danger, I prefer it for the cultures and dialogues that arise in the meetings of community. Because yes, I am an unrepentant border crosser. What I'd like to do right now, before moving to my final concluding remarks, is actually I'd like to take a little bit more of your time and read briefly from, I have one book of short stories in English. And unfortunately, I didn't bring any copies. I'm going to actually move out here. So I'm told I have to turn this. Okay. Can you hear me? All right. I felt like I should be standing on phone books over there. So now I can, you're all tall out here. So it's, one of the things I like being out in this part of the country. Also, it's true, right? We always talk about the weather when in this time of year. Right? I mean, everybody I've talked to when I arrived, I flew into St. Louis yesterday, and I was in southern Illinois yesterday, and everybody asked me, "What do you think of the weather?" And I'd forgotten that, right? Having lived in the Southwest now for the last 7 years, or the last 6 years, I'd forgotten that is an important question, right? Because it's a good way to start a story too. Right, it's a good way to build that connection. So today, when I was in Chicago picking up a rental car, of course the guy at the rental agents was like, "What's the weather like back home?" And I said, "Warmer than here." And he laughed and he said, "Well, today's a nice day." And I laughed and he said, "Well, yeah, given the time of year." And he's absolutely correct, right? It was 30 degrees. So. I actually do I have to confess that I do prefer the cold weather versus the heat. So I'm going to read a couple of stories from my book. One day I'll tell you the things I've seen. It is the first collection of short stories that I have in English. The majority of them are translations that I translated from Spanish. I was originally published in Spanish. I'm a Chicano author who, though I grew up in the United States, I write in Spanish because I think it's important. One is to sort of remember our language and remember the language that I grew up with, and to use that language. Right? So as I always tell my students, my creative writing students, when I ask them about why they're studying Spanish, Their responses are always along the lines of, I'm going to be a teacher, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a business person, and I want to be able to speak to the community. And that to me those are perfectly valid responses. And I always tell my students that yes, that's great, right? But you're looking at Spanish primarily as a transactional thing. It's something that you're going to find useful for talking to other people. But why not use language to create art? Spanish has a long history of writing that is beautiful. And so when I started writing in Spanish, I was trying to tap into that long history. I don't know if I've succeeded, but but for me that's important, right? It is important to sort of continue that tradition of remembering the languages that I speak. This story is titled Over There on the Other Side. And it opens with a quote from a poem by the Chicano poet Gary Soto. Who will know us when we breathe through the grass? La Línea has many stories. Once, while waiting to cross, Moms told me about the time she and my dad first crossed La Línea. It wasn't that hard. Maybe it was because it was the 1960s, decades before various Border Patrol operations made it difficult to cross without papers. Maybe it was because they were from the border that no one questioned when they pulled up to the agent in their borrowed white Mustang. For the agent, they were just a pair of teenagers in love. One of those good-looking couples who crossed because they wanted to cruise around el otro lado. Maybe they were planning to take a walk around downtown Calexico. Maybe they were going shopping in El Centro. Maybe they were going to Brawley for ice cream. And after their cruise, they would return in their ranfla to Mexicali. Maybe that's what went through the border agent's mind as he let them pass without asking too many questions. So easy, so quick. I am waiting in a long line. There are about 15 cars ahead of me. I look at those around me, at the drivers, at their faces. Some are tired, some bored, some anxious. And just a few, are nervous. It is hot, and we're all waiting in cars, waiting to cross La Línea, that line that in other areas is called the border. A man passes by selling newspapers. The main story is about the 72 undocumented migrants massacred in northern Mexico. Many of the victims remain unidentified. I think about one of them, one of those anonymous victims massacred senselessly, one who decided to leave his country, cross Mexico, and then cross over into the United States. One, as so many others before, who would not make it. One who would remain in the registries as the number, unidentified migrant number 5. Between the lines of cars, I see people selling candy and water, Red Cross volunteers asking for donations, kids carrying rags and large bottles of water to clean windshields. I see a man without legs, pushing himself in a wheelchair, a tin cup on his lap. I see a long wait in a long line. My father died the same day that unidentified migrant number 5 was murdered in Tamaulipas. The same day that this man was massacred alongside 71 others who he might or might not have known. I think of the people who arrived for my father's burial, people who came to say goodbye under a blue sky in the August Mexicali heat. People, some like my father, who crossed the border illegally in search of a better life. Some stayed, others came back, and a few went missing. Unidentified migrant number 5, the one who left his country to cross to the other side, the one who accepted the weight of being undocumented so that he could earn money for his family. Maybe he was convinced by an enganchador who promised him loads of dollars and more over there in El Norte. Maybe he left because he had a young wife who was pregnant. Maybe he had a relative over there, someone who could help him get a good job to pay back the enganchador. Of course he must have heard about the danger, the possibility of being robbed or kidnapped, or the likelihood of being enslaved by some cartel. If he did have family on the other side, there was always the chance of losing a finger, a hand, an arm, if he was unable to come up with the ransom. Of course, the danger would have seemed small before the promise of the good life that awaited him over there in el norte, allá en el otro lado. Over there on the other side, that limit that in other parts is called border. Unidentified migrant number 5 will never know the other side. He will never add his story to La Línea as my parents did. He will never know the long lines waiting to cross. He will never pass through the fields of cotton, the cotton fields of Texas, the strawberry fields, the orange groves, the olive orchards of California, the meat packing plants of the Midwest, the construction sites of Chicago and New York City. He will never feel the winter chill of the Northeast, nor the damp summer heat of the South. He will remain just a statistic in the sad history of migration and become just a memory in his family's history. The uncle, the brother, the father who left for the other side and never came back. He will remain like my father, a blurry memory of a figure saying goodbye from a doorway and driving away in his car. My turn. The border guard scrutinizes me from behind dark sunglasses. In his hands, he holds my passport. He checks out the old white Mustang that I'm driving. What are you bringing from Mexico, he asks. Nothing. Nothing more than my dead, I want to respond. But I simply say, nothing. So that story started off, if you remember, in about 2010, the case of the tragedy of the 72 massacred Central American migrants in northern Mexico. And at this point, the level of violence that had been, the wave of violence that had been hitting northern Mexico had gotten to a point where the writer Alma Guillermo Prieto decided enough, something has to be done. And so she invited 72 writers to take one of the victims and to write a story about that victim. I chose unidentified migrant number 5 because I wanted to imagine that this migrant could have had many different types of lives, and what were the possibilities, and how that life could also be a story that's very similar to for many of us who have histories of migration. In the case of my father, my parents were able to make it across. I often say, my parents came across the border about 3 months before I was born. So I often tell my students I was hecho en Mexico, but born in the USA. Right? So I am a child of border crossing. I am a product of that migration. I'm going to do one more story. This is a story called Sleepwalker, about 2 young brats. 2 young kids. Well, one is not so young. Sleepwalker. Months later, the same nightmare. I had fallen into the irrigation ditch, and the current was taking me to the tunnel beneath the highway. I would flail in my sleep in an attempt to get out of the ditch and onto the ground. My brother Todd, he suffered the same dark dream. There were nights when I would wake up to hear him thrashing in his bed, raising his arms, diving under the covers, grabbing a pillow, and then breathing deeply, knowing that he had saved me. Todd was a sleepwalker. He acted out his dreams with such intensity that moms had to lock the bedroom door at night so he wouldn't get away. For years, I lived those dreams too, because we shared a room. He would kick the air, applaud, act out scenes from Star Wars, stuff like that. One night, moms forgot to lock the door and he walked out. I followed. We walked down the quiet street by the light of the moon. I watched the homes of my mostly sleeping neighbors. There were a few televisions on, occasionally a dim light, but mainly the houses were dark. At Daniel's house, I saw a shadow in the window. My Dia, I thought, waiting as she always did. We wandered around the hood until I could finally guide my brother back home. And after that night, we had to go to bed zipped up in a sleeping bag he had to go to bed zipped up in a sleeping bag to restrict his movements. His voice on the phone, barely audible, hoarse. There's a lot of noise on the line. Ruido blanco. He calls from beyond a storm of static. A voice calling from another planet. As a kid, he was a sleepwalker. Now he's an insomniac. I can see him standing there, whispering to me on the phone. He's too thin, his gaze distant and blank. I know that he is nervously scratching at the scars that mark his arms. He's telling me about his trip to Soledad. I look out the window. Snow. His voice coming from across 3,000 miles of continent and 3 time zones. He in San Francisco, I in Hanover, New Hampshire. A storm of ruido blanco between us, his voice scrambled in the night world. There's a photo of us draped to the wall of my dorm room. We're standing on a hill. Behind us are the ditch and the orchard. He is dressed in that style he brought back with him after his first year at Cornell. Khaki pants, ironed flannel shirt, buttoned to the top, shiny shoes. No one could understand why he returned with that look, that very East Los look, an urban SoCal Cholo look showing up in rural northern Califas. Me, I'm in my usual uniform of jeans, black t-shirt with the Green Lantern logo, and scuffed Nike shoes. He went to Soledad because they said he'd find our father there. I never understood why he insisted on looking for that guy. Maybe he thought he could save him. Todd had always been that way, looking for damaged people to save. Maybe he thought he could save himself. One morning, Todd walked out of the camper where he was crashing and headed for the nearby hills. The insomnia made everything more intense. The colors, the sky, the landscape, and a stop sign captivated him. Dark stains appeared to be eating at the white STOP. The letters slowly dripped down into the red and mixed with the stains. They meant something dark and horrible. Freaky ese. I touched that sign and felt an odd vibra. Neta, brother. I felt like those manchas sensed me and began to move toward my fingers. I lifted my hand and, I don't know, I felt something strange. A heavy sense of cansancio, and I fell asleep right there. He says all this, and then he sighs. He dreamt. He was sitting beneath the stop sign when Dad drove up in a black car. Todd stood up and called to him. No response. The car moved forward, heading towards the hills. Todd began to chase the car, yelling out his name. He couldn't catch up. He slipped, and he fell beside the road. I woke up when I hit a rock. I stood up. I was alone in the hills, scratched up, bleeding from one of my knees. And nothing. Nada. I walked down the hill to the camper, never found our dad. I always arrive 5 minutes after he leaves. The only thing I find is his echo. A long silence. I hear someone ask my brother something. No response. Then I hear him sighing deeply. I saved you, brother. Do you remember? That time you fell into the acequia? Of course. Maybe tal vez I'll save you sometime, I said. Doubted ese. I doubted a lot. Check this out. Check this, brother. Check out what I'm going to tell you. Are you ready? Tell moms that I know how this will end. What? Ruido blanco on the line, coughing, the hoarse whispered voice that comes from a long ways away. I know how this will end. And then silence. I'm left holding the phone, wind, static. I close my eyes and I see the stop sign, the melting letters, the dark stains, the echo of a person who could no longer be saved. I think I'll read one final one called La Línea. The border agent looks at you, but you can only see yourself reflected in his mirrored sunglasses. You are sitting behind the wheel of the old white Mustang. The agent is interrogating you, asking you the typical questions. You already know them all, but you have to act as if it is the first time you have heard them and take them as seriously as if you were interviewing for a job where you would have to risk your life with the incessant traffic of Southern California. the migra checkpoints, the helicopters from the television networks, the Highway Patrol, the Armed Forces, and the Border Patrol, flying over the landscape, and all the other daily difficulties that make living in these borderlands so different. Never a dull moment, nonstop excitement. That is what the border interview promises you. Another side that is like this side, but only with a different government, but a similar attitude of disdain for its border communities. And the questions: what was your purpose for your visit to Mexico? What are you bringing from Mexico? Sometimes there are others. Where were you born? Where are you going? Who owns this car? If the agent wants, they can ask you the same questions up to 5 times. You think it might have been better if you had stayed in Tijuana, sitting on a terraza looking out over the sea, a line of beer, Tecate, Pacifico, Sol, whatever was served, waiting for you while you watched the sun dip into the ocean. And later, you would cross the street to shoot pool with the usual gang, drinking Tecate and listening to 80s music from the jukebox. But no, there you are, on the line, La Línea. And while the agent asks you the usual questions, you want to respond: to lose myself a while. Nothing more than my dad. Nothing more than a notebook full of stories and a camera filled with snapshots of people. But how could the Border Patrol agents understand? They who have never truly felt what it means to wander. How could they understand a trip stitched together by stories and photos? Where am I going? ¿A dónde voy? Home. A mi home. But at that precise moment, you really don't know where it is. You see yourself reflected in the agent's sunglasses. He is interrogating you so that you can be allowed back into your country. And at that moment, you realize that you would much rather stay there, in the space between nations, stuck in that moment, without going forward or backward, to think about where you were going to do, where you were going. Gracias. I'm going to... Thank you. We live in trying times. As I told the students yesterday in Decatur, I am making it through the emergency, the national emergency very well. Thank you. I've been waiting for the runs on water and so forth, but nothing has happened yet. But I would like to say this: it's going to be all right. Before I conclude, I would like to quote from 2 poems. The first is from the Chicano poet Juan Felipe Herrera, from his poem Song Out Here, that's included in this collection, Notes on the Assemblage. If I could sing, you would hear me and I would tell you, it's gonna be all right. It's gonna be all right. It's gonna be all right. It would be something like that. Can you turn around so I can look into your eyes? Just for once, your eyes. And finally, I would like to quote from another poem, this time by Luis Alberto Urrea, from his collection of poetry, Tijuana Book of the Dead. Listen, carnales, listen to the hymn of it, the lie of it, the prayer of it, the voices singing our names. Listen, it's our story. It's our song. You've got to hear it. Listen. So, mi gente, let's remember this. What we have to do is listen. Just listen. Listen, mi gente. Listen. Gracias. I feel like I should curtsy. Thank you. Are we going to do questions? Are there any questions? I don't know if there are any questions. Normally, I do more questions than sort of do reading things, so I don't know if there are any questions. I have to tell you that it's going to be amazing when Urrea shows up in a month. His book, if you haven't had a chance to read it, definitely read it. You have a month, plus you have like trivia night, and you have all sorts of exciting events. So I'm really happy to be here with you all. And to be able to get to talk about this, because I think that this kind of project is really important for a community, right? To bring together a community and to create a community of readers. So I don't know if there are any. Yes.
I read
I read in your bio before you came, and then you said it again tonight, and I'm interested in why you chose the adjective, or why you choose the adjective unrepentant to describe yourself.
Because I feel that people of color in this country, we are often, whether it's on purpose or not, we don't realize it, we're often given this excuse me tongue. We have to justify ourselves for everything that we do. And so when I say that I'm an unrepentant border crosser, it means that I don't need to justify why I do it. I do it because I like it. It's important. It's necessary. And I would invite all of you to do it too, right? In crossing any borders, really. I mean, I cross not just national borders, but I also cross academic borders. I work in different departments. I work in different fields, right? And I think that for me, that is where my place is. My place is to be in the in-between and to recognize the possibilities of all of those, opportunities. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. That all of the possibilities that come up, and to be able to take them. But the first response, the short response is yes. I mean, we find ourselves in this country often having to justify what we do, or why we're here, and it's for me to be able to claim, yes, I'm an unrepentant border crosser, as well as an unrepentant Spanglish speaker, right, is a recognition of who I am as a person, right, as an individual, and hopefully convince my students that they too can also stand up and say, sí, yo también, right? Me too. I'm also unrepentant. I don't have to justify my presence in this country, that country, or whatever country. Thank you for the question. Thank you. Any other questions? I know I just sound very strident all of a sudden. Yes. But it is important, right? Because it's important. I had a long conversation yesterday with students at Millikan when we were talking about this question of how we present ourselves, right? And and there's a line from a poem that I really like where the poet says, I would like to get rid of this excuse me tongue, right? She's a Chicana writer who feels that often that there's this notion that to speak as a woman, as Chicana, she has to sort of make excuses. Oh, allow me, can I speak up? Can I say things? Can I say this? And we see this a lot in writing of color, right? This notion of communities that feel themselves not being allowed to speak, so that they're marginalized, they're forced into silence. And I think it's important that we allow these communities to speak up. To be able to, that we can hear their stories, to listen to what they have to say. I feel like I'm sinning because I'm here on the altar. Padre, perdóname.
In the book, I just read the beginning part, but all the men are disappearing and they don't have any men left over in their town. So now when people migrate, our whole family's coming over, so we're not splitting up the families, so that they can stay together as families. So would that more than migration be together rather than just having the men come over and send money back?
I hear an echo, so I'm not quite sure I heard that. So yeah, talking about migration and the separation of families, wouldn't it be easier if the whole family came over? There's an interesting aspect of our border policy is that when everything is weird about our border policy, but one of the aspects of our border policy is that the way that the border policy used to work is that it allowed a certain amount of migration north and south, right? So you would have families that would be able to move. So we had a lot of circular migration that was taking place. But as the borders become much more dense, as the laws start changing, it becomes more difficult. And so, yes, you had at one point in the late 90s, let me step back a few decades. When I was young, I had family in the migrant camps, and I would go visit my relatives in the migrant camps, and I remember that there were always families there. Right? So this is in the 70s, and so we would hang out with the other kids who were also in these camps. In the late 90s, if I visited camps to meet with people, what I found was they were primarily men who were alone, because the border crossing became much more difficult to have this kind of circular migration that used to exist. And this is also the time period when we start seeing in the maquiladoras, the factories on the border, that their primary workforce was female. So the border then created this very weird, not just a separation between nations, but a separation between genders. Right? So I don't have any policy. I'm not a policy maker, but I do think that we definitely have to review our border policies to figure out a way in which we're not separating families, in which we're not putting kids in cages, right? In which we're not, or losing kids in the system, right? Where you have cases of children who cannot be returned to their parents because nobody knows where they are, and that to me is a crime. Right? And so we have to figure out a way to work on a border policy that takes family into account. Right? Now, I'm not quite sure what the answer is. In my case, when I was a child, I remember it being much easier. I was also in my discussion yesterday with the students, I talked about how the border fence has changed. We've always had a fence. So this whole notion about a barrier is, I find a very strange discussion. When I was a child, the fence was a chain link fence between Calexico and Mexicali, right? So you could see through it. It was easy to cross. My grandmother from Mexicali would often go shopping in Calexico. Because it was just easy, you just cross daily. That was a very easy thing. In fact, when I would spend my summers in Mexicali, I would do the same thing. I'd just go for long walks, and I'd just cross the border, cross over to Calexico for como si nada, right? Just easy, just kind of come back after walking around. In the 90s, the fence became a corrugated tin wall. I'm sure you've probably seen the photographs of the wall in Tijuana, right? How it goes into the sea, right? That's the fence that I remember in the 90s. In the 80s and the 70s, it was actually a chain link fence that was often sort of tore down. Now the fence is a series of pylons, very tall pylons, on the beach. What I find really interesting about the wall is the way that artists use it for expression. There's a photograph I took a couple of years ago when I was in Tijuana, written on the very top of the border, or spray painted on the very top of the border wall on the Mexican side. It says empathy, right? And I think this is what we need, empathy. We need to figure out a policy that is empathetic to both sides. Too often, border policy is created far from the border, doesn't take into account the realities of what we have, of how we live on the line. Another project I once saw on the border wall, which I always think about when I go down to the beach, is in the late 90s. Someone had installed plywood. Pieces of plywood, and painted the names of all the migrants who had died trying to cross the border after the construction of, or the creation of Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Hold the Line, which were these border patrol operations which strengthened the barriers in the urban crossings, enforcing migration. Those who wanted to cross undocumented, forced them to go through the desert or through the mountains. And so this wall was basically a list of names, ages, and places of origin. And it was tragic. There were hundreds of names on this wall, and I used to walk up and down the wall just reading the names. One that I think is a little bit more hopeful than that is an Israeli artist, who's an Israeli artist, she went and she painted out the wall. She painted the pylons, and from a distance, it looks like there's a hole in it, right? So she's just sort of doing the Trump oil effect. And so it was a really, really cool sort of project. Going back to the question about families, I think it's important, right, that we figure out a border policy that takes into account, right, these conditions. But and in regards to this question of a wall, we should think about, what does a wall mean? Right? What does a wall mean? If your wall is a chain link fence and you can see through the other side, that implies, there's still a barrier, but it implies a connection and a recognition that these are communities that live together. When you start closing off that wall, that neighbor, you're now implying a different type of connection, one that's often antagonistic. Right? And that's not, I don't think that's the way that neighbors should work. Right? What do I know? That's just my thinking. Anybody else?
Oh, good.
Pardon?
Who are some of your favorite Latin American authors?
Oh, some of my favorite Latin American authors. Oh, yes. Love writer questions. I started reading Latin American writers when I was around 18. Right? So I grew up reading, of course, I started reading U.S. authors when I was younger. Like Stephen King was one of my favorites when I was a kid, right? And then Kurt Vonnegut was another one of my favorites, and this is probably why I became so sarcastic as a teen. But one of the first writers that I was like, I got to read everything, was Garcia Marquez. And I read not 100 Years of Solitude. I read Chronicle of a Death Foretold. Because I'm kind of a nerd, I read the newspaper, right? So I was reading reviews, and I read this review of this book, this slim novel about this story where you already know the end, right? And I thought, that sounds really cool. So I read it, and I was blown away. Right? So Garcia Marquez was one of the first Latin American authors that I read, and I read all of his work at the time. I read it in translation. And I think they're really fantastic translations. I don't really I read in Spanish, obviously, right? But I have no problems in reading in translation because I especially if there's a really good translation. So I like to see how translated works dialogue with the original work, right? Especially in regards to Latin American fiction. Juan Rulfo is a Mexican author. He was one of my favorites. Especially I love to say that I have his collected works. I have everything he ever published. It's about this thin. It's a very slim volume. And it consists basically of a collection of short stories, El Llano en Llamas and Pedro Páramo, and a screenplay, El Gallo de Oro. But it is amazing, an amazing body of work. It's a work that shows you rural Mexico following the revolution. Right? And the echoes and the specters that sort of haunt the history of especially the mountainous regions of the state of Jalisco. Aside from the magical realist authors like Garcia Marquez and Cortázar, I really like Clarice Lispector. She's a Brazilian writer. She was amazing, and I think there's a collection of her work was translated in English last year, and she is just truly a spectacular writer, or she was truly a spectacular writer. Of the recent works that I'm reading right now, I'm sure that many of you have probably read Valeria Luiselli, either The Story of My Teeth or the essay Tell Me How It Ends, which is beautiful. I'm currently reading, it's her first book written in English. It's a novel, The Lost Children's Archive, right? The Lost Children's Archive. And it's a road novel in some ways, but it's also it's built around her essay, Tell Me How It Ends. And it's about all of these children that are arriving to the border without families, right? And how how the narrator starts to work with these communities to tell their stories, capture their stories, right? So that's a really great book. Francisco Goldman is also he's another Latin American writer. He writes primarily in English. His two of his books for me are very powerful, and one thing you're going to notice is right currently I read a lot of books about grief, because the book I'm working on is about grief. It's about loss, and so two of his books, Say Her Name, which is about the death of his wife, and I'm now drawing a blank on the second part, which is about life in Mexico City after, right, trying to sort of like come back to life after the death of his wife, and it's a specter that haunts both works. And in terms of Chicano authors, right, I have many that I consider friends, but I also consider them mentors. Sana Cisneros, for me, was one of those writers who really sort of opened my eyes to other forms of expression, and also a Midwestern Latina, right? She's from Chicago. Ana Castillo is another writer who I greatly admire. Luis Alberto Urrea, who we've talked about. If you haven't had a chance to read The House of Broken Angels, go out and get it now. It's so good. A lot of the poets that I mentioned. When I wrote my book in English, I made it a point to quote Chicano writers because they're not the only writers that I read, but they are writers who informed me, and I want their voices to be also part of the book that I'm writing. So people like Gary Soto, Juan Felipe Herrera, our former poet laureate, right, Juan Felipe Herrera. Those are just a few. Thanks. I don't know if there's. Are we? Is the hook going to come and drag me off stage, off the altar,
so.
like in Sábado Gigante?
Hi, thanks. Let's have a round of applause. Thank you so much, Santiago.
Thank you. Can I take a picture? Can I take a selfie of all of us? Is that okay? Okay. I always forget to do this, because I like to do this when I give talks, and especially I love to do this in a church. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
You all look fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks again. I hope you all will forgive me. I'm a millennial, so my notes are on my phone. As our last and somewhat anticlimactic speaker this evening, I promise I'll be brief. I just wanted to take a moment to share some gratitude on behalf of the Kenosha Public Library and also the NEA Big Read. I want to thank those fantastic Aztec dancers for sharing their talents with us. Weren't they wonderful? I also want to thank the St. Mark's community for welcoming us into this beautiful space. I want to thank our new friend Santiago for traveling to visit us and sharing all of his stories this evening. Thank you so much. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming out and sharing this kickoff celebration with us. We're so glad to have you all here. Let's have a round of applause for yourselves too. Come on, yes, thank you. This year's NEA Big Read is sure to be a vibrant and special one, and as I think we've already seen, thanks to our many community partners. We look forward to seeing you at these events throughout the month as we come together as a community to discuss and engage with the many layers into the beautiful North has to offer. And we hope to see you in a month back in this space when Luis Alberto Urrea joins us for our grand finale. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful 2019 NEA Big Read. If you haven't gotten a copy of your brochure yet, we've got plenty on the table out there. There are all kinds of events all month. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much. Have a good night.